Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel, and welcome to the first ever AMA or Ask Me Anything video on my channel. If you like this kind of content, let me know in the comments below and give me a like and subscribe if you don't mind. And while you're at it down there in the comments, leave your questions for a future AMA video because I'd love to do more of these if it's useful to you. Let's get right into it. At BlunderNoob64 says, "Hi Patrick, I'm a piano player, and since I was a boy, I've always dreamed of playing the pipe organ. You and me both. How hard is it to transition to learning the pipe organ if I've been playing piano since I was little? Does standard repertoire like Bach conventions or hand carry over to learning organ? God bless." Well, God bless you too. So how hard is it to transition? I think it's only as hard as you make it, right? So many of the fundamental keyboard skills absolutely will carry over. You've learned your scales and your arpeggios on the piano. That's going to serve you really well on the organ. The things you're going to want to focus on are playing very legato, right? You don't have a sustain pedal to help you out, so really practice your legato playing. And then, the best thing to do is just learn the terminology of the organ, learn to register, do a lot of trial and error. And I'll throw down in the description below a link to a little handout that I did for the recent Colorado Sacred Music Conference. It's kind of like a beginner's guide or a pianist's guide to understanding organ terminology and basics of registration. So I'll link that below. So it's only as hard as you make it. If you go into it with a positive attitude, I think you're going to find the transition is just fine. And the second part of your question was, does standard repertoire, like say Bach, that maybe you've learned on the piano, translate well to organ technique? Absolutely. If you're playing Bach on the piano, you've already got a good foundation. Bach's counterpoint, it's not really any different on the organ fundamentally, except that maybe there are more voices. So it's a great foundation. It absolutely will apply. Keep learning that stuff. All right, moving on. At Marco Lombardi 8660 says, "I'm looking at versets for the Magnificat, for example, written by Frescobaldi, but also many other composers. I'm interested in how this would work in the liturgical context. Would the choir sing 2 lines and the organ respond and so forth? Have you ever tried this liturgically?" Yes. And here's kind of where that came from and how that worked. At some point in the history of Catholic liturgical music, it was concluded that the organ could, in certain instances, take the place of the singers. So the organ could actually essentially sing certain parts of the liturgy. Now you're asking about the Magnificat, which is of course an antiphon at Vespers, but this also could happen at Mass as well. The Gloria, for example, perhaps the priest will intone the Gloria, and the choir will take up a stanza, the organ will take up a stanza in alternatum, so on and so forth. And the reason that this was licit and you could do this is because the priest, regardless of what the choir and the organ are doing, the priest is going to be reciting the prayer beginning to end anyway. So it's not like anything gets left out in terms of the prayer being recited, but it was just concluded that the organ could in fact take up stanzas of what otherwise would be sung. Moving on, at Back to School 1611, I think you had a few questions for me, but we'll take them in order here. For organ playing, how does one learn hand and feet coordination? I'm a student and this is quite difficult to get at times. Yeah, it can be quite difficult to get at times, no doubt about it. I think especially for someone who's transitioning to the organ from the piano, it's difficult. But here's how I would say you approach it: slowly and intentionally. One thing I found that works really well, and this may not apply to all organists, but I'll share what's worked well for me. A lot of teachers will tell you to get your metronome out and separate your right hand, left hand pedals, learn each of them, then try to put them together. For my own musical ability, I found that I struggle to get it all together if I separate it all out. And I'm not saying don't separate them out, especially if you have a tricky passage, say, in the left hand. By all means, separate out the left hand and really dial in that passage. But when you're trying to get that coordination between right hand, left hand, and feet, I say take your metronome way down to a slow speed and learn it all together. Force yourself to get that coordination right out of the gate instead of wasting time separating the parts out. I'm sure there are lots of different opinions on that, but that's how I approach that. All right, so you also asked, can piano technique books work for organ, or should I use organ-specific technique books? I would recommend sticking with organ-specific technique books if you're really talking about learning the organ seriously. It's, again, not that techniques wouldn't cross over between piano and organ. Again, the basic, keyboard techniques for sure. But if you're serious about learning organ, get yourself into some better, organ instruction books. I haven't looked at what's out there in literally decades at this point, so I'm not sure I have a great recommendation for you off the top of my head. If I think of anything, I'll put it in the description below, but I'd say definitely look for organ-specific stuff. Another question from Back to School 1611. What books for Gregorian chant do you recommend? I sing in a scola and currently use the Liber Brevior. My Liber Usualis is just too chunky. I know. But the notes and texts are so small. Do you have any other resources that I could look into? Yes, absolutely. So the Liber is a beautiful book. I love the Liber, but I understand, you're right, that it's a lot to hold and the text is tiny, right? So here's what I do, and I know this will probably offend some people too, but when my priority is on legibility and an easy to read score, I will print a PDF of the particular chant and have it on a full 8.5 by 11 size, maybe in a nice binder or something if I'm visible and need the aesthetic. And there's a bunch of places where you could find, pretty much every chant under the sun. Again, I'll link a few things down in the description to places where you can go and find whatever chant it is that you're looking for, print it out on whatever size you want. Heck, print it out on 11 by 17, print it out on ARC D paper, I don't care. Print it as big as you want. There's something beautiful about holding the real book, but if you really not the real book, I'm not talking about the jazz real book, if anyone gets that reference. I mean, holding the real Liber. I love the Liber, but there are times when it's better just to have more legible chant for sure. All right, at VLLBV asks, I'd like to know if it's possible to get some online and free method to training feet for playing pedals. Absolutely, and I'm not going to elaborate too much on that. That's another one where I'll say check out the description. I will add a link to some really good videos that will help you get started on pedals or improve your pedaling technique. Second question you asked, I'd also like to know this. We have a lot of sacred music, including for solo singers. The lack of its execution in Mass is a liturgical problem or just caused by musical difficulty. Okay, great question and can of worms. You're totally right. There is a humongous repertoire of really, really beautiful sacred music available to us in the Catholic Church. And so why don't we hear more of it sung? Gosh, I think there's so many contributing factors that have led to sort of this degradation of the quality of sacred music over the years. And honestly, this probably deserves a video all of its own, but let me just hit on a couple high points. First and foremost, a lot of people like to blame Vatican II for this, and while Vatican II certainly exacerbated the problem with some of the wishy-washy language in the documents, including Sacrosanctum Concilium, which, by the way, still says the Gregorian chant should have pride of place and the organ should be the primary instrument, right? But I would argue that the degradation of the quality of sacred music began a long time before Vatican II, and Vatican II just kind of opened the floodgates to what we then saw later in the forms of much more secular styles coming into the Mass, and so we see these folk masses, or we see jazz masses, or we see life teen masses with rock and roll bands, or whatever it may be, none of which is in fact what the Church has instructed and asked throughout her history, right up to and including Pope Francis in a talk that he gave just a handful of years ago. And so I think a lot of factors have contributed, and I'll also note very briefly, another one I think is that by and large Catholic churches have been horrible about paying a decent wage to musicians. It's all too common in a Catholic parish for the pastor's sentiment, and I'm not blaming these pastors. They may not have been well formed, they may not know any better, they may think they're too financially strapped to do anything different, but how many times have we all heard, oh well, God gave you that gift, you should just give it back. Like, well, yes, and thanks be to God he gave me the gift, but by the way, I also spent years and a lot of money learning to to use this gift well. And a lot of folks have been through 4 year or 8 years of musical training on the post-secondary level. So I think the Catholic Church has been worse than many other denominations in that respect, and you do get what you pay for. If we're not if a parish is unwilling to pay a reasonable rate, I'm not saying you got to pay 6 figures to an organist, but I'm saying just a reasonable compensation for the time involved, and same with music directors, then you can't expect to have Voce 8 quality music at your Mass, or Olivier Letry quality organ at your Mass. You're not going to get it, right? And so without going too far down the rabbit hole, I'll also address one other thing. You wondered if maybe it's just musical difficulty. No, I don't think musical difficulty is the problem at all. That's not to say that there's not extraordinarily difficult music that's also very beautiful, both for the organ and for voices. But I think there's also a humongous repertoire of very accessible music. Beautiful chants, beautiful hymnody, beautiful simple polyphony that really, really reflects what the Catholic Church has asked of music, and we still don't hear a whole lot of that in many parishes. But I want to leave this one on a positive note, because I would say I've been in church music now for, I'm going to actually date myself here a little bit, so I've been working professionally in church music for 24 years now. And I have seen, just in my own 24 years in church music, a wonderful trend toward improvement, toward a return to a faithful interpretation of what sacred music is. That's not to say I haven't come upon some real duds out there. I certainly have. But I think there's a momentum now, and I think things are going to continue to improve in sacred music. That's my hope. That's my prayer, and that's so far been my observation. So I'm gonna go with the positive note there and say things are going in the right direction, and hopefully every one of you watching can be part of that solution as we move forward. All right, next question. At Isaiah Baggett, I hope I said that right, 5014 asks, I'm a composer with a choral background, and I'm starting to compose 1 to 2 minute organ pieces for church services. Do I notate flutes or strings and let the organist do registration? What if I have a solo voice in mind? Do I put solo or specify reed or vox humana? I don't know if I'm micromanaging or not being specific enough. Thanks so much. Great question. Thanks for that. It's up to you, but if you do have a clear tonal idea in your head of what you want the piece to sound like, I would say err on the side of giving more information to the organist. Put the registration there. I mean, you look at the great works of Vidor and Vierne and Guimont. They gave suggested registrations, and you can call it that, suggested registration, if you want, but feel free to give those registrations, especially for solo voices. If you had a cornet in mind, but you just say solo, and I pick a crumhorn, it's probably not going to give the desired effect. Now, with that said, I and probably every other organist out there will feel perfectly free to throw your recommendations out the window if we disagree with them because of the instrument we're playing, the room we're playing in, the application, for which we're using your piece of music. We will take whatever license we need, right? It really is a suggestion. But I would say don't shy away from putting your recommended registrations out there. Give us all the details you want. Let us know what you want it to sound like, and then we'll adapt it to our situation. But great question. And one more from you as well. I'd like to buy a few keyboards to practice pipe organ music on. Do you know of any good keyboards for a 2-manual home virtual setup? Yeah, when I did my first Hauptwerk organ at home, practice organ at home, I used 2 Behringer UMX 610, I think that's the model. Behringer UMX 610 keyboards. They're 61-note MIDI capable keyboards, and I would just stack the one on top of the other and use books or something to prop the second one up as this kind of the swell manual. I found that for what they were, they had a pretty good touch, they felt reasonably realistic, and I was able to practice 2-manual literature very easily with Hauptwerk, or you could do it with a Grandorg, or whatever other virtual pipe organ software you want to work with. So that would be my recommendation. All right, at Philip Powell 3320, hi Philip, asks, I'd be interested to hear about any obscure pieces you found and loved over the years. Thanks. Great question. Obscure, I'm not sure how obscure this is, but I think it's certainly not that common because I haven't really heard many or found many recordings of it on YouTube, for example, but René Becker wrote a great sonata, for his first sonata in G major. There's a couple of movements of that I really, really like, and I don't know anybody else who plays it, and I haven't found a ton of recordings of it, so I'd say Becker's work is quite nice, and that piece in particular, that suite in particular, I really enjoy. Actually, I recorded a couple movements of that on the pipe organ that I learned on as a very wee lad when I was growing up in Pennsylvania, and I'll throw a link to that down in the description too if that's of interest to anybody. All right, another one from at Back to School 1611. Where can I get the antiphons with the verses for communion chants? The Liber Brevior and Liber Usualis only have the antiphons, but the verses are not there. Did the monks just get lazy? Why aren't these in the books? Well, no, the monks didn't just get lazy. I suspect these monks were not even remotely lazy. And why aren't they in the books? Well, we've already addressed the fact that the Liber is a pretty hefty book as is, and so to throw all of those verses in there would only exacerbate that problem. So I think they chose to say, hey, the antiphons are critical. You must sing the antiphon. The verses are optional. You don't have to sing them. But yeah, where can you get them? There's a book called the Communio that is published by CMAA, the Church Music Association of America, that has all of the verses for the communion chants. And it can be used in either the 62 rite, extraordinary form, traditional Latin Mass, Tridentine rite, whatever the heck you like to call it, or with the Novus Ordo, the 2011 Missal. And in fact, I'll link that in the description as well, because you can actually get a free PDF version of it if you prefer, and can then print your scores. So, and finally, one more from Back to School 1611. Lots of questions from you, but I love it. Thank you. What is the history of the organ and singing in liturgy? Can you explain the liturgy? Okay, well, can I explain the liturgy? You'd want to go to somebody who's much more of an expert than I to really explain the liturgy, but in the shortest and simplest terms, the liturgy is the Catholic Church's public worship of God. That's what it is. And so, because it is that public worship and kind of a uniting act, we have some very strict forms and formulas and prayers and orders of operations that go into the liturgy. That's what it is. It's just a formal public prayer of the church. The history of singing in the liturgy goes all the way back to before the Catholic Church, in the Jewish tradition, when they would chant the Psalms. And that tradition of chanting the Psalms then kind of came into the Catholic tradition very early on, and over time developed into what we now call Gregorian chant. And from there was just kind of this organic development, a series of excesses that popes had to correct, and then, it all kind of was really made cohesive with a document from St. Pius X called Trellus Latitudini, in which he basically said there are three proper forms of Catholic sacred music: Gregorian chant, sacred polyphony, and hymnody. And he said, simplest guideline to determine whether something is good and fitting for Mass, the closer it is to the form, and I can't remember his wording, but the closer it is to the kind of form and sound of Gregorian chant, the more suited it is for the temple, and the farther away from it goes, the less suitable it is. So you can imagine that a lot of what we do here, maybe in an average parish, has strayed pretty far from what the popes have said we ought to be doing. The history of the organ in the liturgy: we really didn't see a ton of organ in the liturgy until the medieval period, but the organ dates back to, like 3rd century BC Greece. And I want to say it was somewhere in the 700s AD that there were some kings and various leaders, royal leaders, started to request that organs be put into their chapels. And that was really kind of where we started to get the organ being used in the liturgy. And again, then it just developed organically. And I'll draw special attention to what we call the French school, because if you look at how the organ has been used in church over the years, like if we look at the Baroque, the German Baroque, for example, we can't really call that a Catholic tradition per se. Not that it's not fitting, not that you shouldn't play Bach. Bach is fine, but it really didn't develop out of a Catholic tradition. But the French school has been Catholic at its core all the way through. The great French composers were all playing in Catholic churches, and so much of the French literature, especially the Romantic literature, and then moving into the kind of French school of improvisation, is all built and based on Gregorian chant, and it really is this very Catholic form of music. As with anything, you'll find excesses in that school of thought as well, but I happen to really like that French school because it is so authentically Catholic and has developed organically with the liturgy through the centuries. This is slightly future me realizing I missed an important question, which was from I hope I pronounced this right, John Paul Roach 4236. Do you ever get bored of your improvisations and feel like you're just repeating the same old tricks over and over again? If so, how do you fix this? Absolutely. I think anyone who improvises finds ourselves occasionally stuck in that kind of a rut. So here's my recommendation. You get to that spot where you feel like, gosh, you just keep using the same motifs and mechanisms and ideas over and over again, and it's just boring the heck out of you now. Don't give up. Play more. Go listen to some really good improvisers, maybe some of your favorites, or maybe even go find somebody you're unfamiliar with. Go look up some of Olivier Latrue's work, look up Daniel Roth's work, look up David Briggs. there's so many great organ improvisers out there. Look them up, critically listen to their improvisations, and maybe identify 3 new tactics from their playing that you haven't used, and then you go drill those, woodshed those, man. Get really good at them, and then start to incorporate those into your playing. And next time it happens, go do it again. You will grow, your improvisations will improve, and you'll get out of that rut. So I hope that answers those questions reasonably sufficiently from my perspective and my background. As I said at the beginning, I would love to do more of these videos if it's interesting and useful to you. So put your questions for the next AMA down in the comments, and if I get some good ones, we'll do another video. Thank you again to those of you who submitted comments, questions, and we'll see you next time. Take care. God bless.